Hello, my name is Stephanie Richburg, and the title of my proposed study is Overlooked at the Intersection Menopause and Reentry of Justice Involved Women. As I reviewed the literature and refined my research focus, I kept returning to a central question. What happens when a woman is navigating an internal transition and an external transition at the same time? Menopause represents an internal transition involving biological, psychological, and social changes. Community reentry represents an external transition involving new environments, systems, relationships, and expectations. This study explores that intersection through the lived experiences of justice involved women residing in halfway houses during community reentry. This qualitative phenomenological study explores the lived experiences of justice involved women aged 40 to 65 residing in halfway houses during community reentry. The study seeks to answer two research questions. How do justice involved women aged 40 to 65 residing in halfway houses interpret and understand the physical and emotional changes associated with menopause during community reentry? The second question asks, how do justice involved women aged 40 to 65 describe the influence of menopause related changes on their overall well-being during community reentry? So, to understand why this study is important, imagine a woman in her late 40s or early 50s residing in a halfway house after incarceration. She is experiencing sleep disturbances, mood changes, irritability, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and emotional distress. Staff may interpret these behaviors as resistance, emotional instability, or noncompliance. However, what if the behaviors are not simply behavioral concerns? What if they are related to menopause reentry stressors or the interactions of both? Questions such as these led to the current study and help clarify why the biopsychosocial framework and the person and environment perspective were the most appropriate frameworks for this study. The biopsychosocial framework is commonly used in healthcare and social work because it encourages practitioners to examine the whole person. The biological dimension asks what is happening in the body. The psychological dimension asks what is happening emotionally, cognitively, and mentally. The social dimension asks what is happening within the person's relationships, environment, and life circumstances. Together, these dimensions help practitioners understand individuals within the context of their lived experiences rather than focusing on symptoms alone. Ontologically, the framework assumes that reality is multidimensional. In other words, menopause cannot be understood through biology alone. For example, two women may experience similar hormonal changes but have very different experiences depending on their stress levels, support system, healthcare access, and life circumstances. Epistemologically, the framework assumes that knowledge is gained by examining how biological, psychological, and social factors interact. For example, when a woman reports anxiety, sleep disturbances, and difficulty concentrating, the framework encourages us to look beyond a single explanation and consider how multiple factors may be shaping experiences or her experiences. What makes this framework particularly relevant is that the same biological, psychological, and social dimensions commonly examined in trauma, behavior health, and social work practices are also affected during menopause. Biologically, women experience hormonal fluctuations and physical changes. Psychologically, many women report mood changes, anxiety, sleep disturbances, and brain fog. Socially, socially, access to healthcare, support system, education, and environmental resources can influence how symptoms are recognized and addressed. The person and environment perspective complements this framework by recognizing that people do not experience challenges in isolation. Ontologically, the perspective assumes that people and environments are interconnected. Epistemologically, it assumes that knowledge develops through understanding how individuals interact with and respond to their environments. The person and environment perspective asks what changes are occurring around the person. This includes environment, systems, relationships, institutions. For justice involved women, these factors may include halfway house regulations, supervision requirements, healthcare access, community resources, and broader correctional and social service systems. The conceptual model proposes that menopause related biological changes interact with psychological responses and environmental conditions within halfway house settings. Key constructs include menopausal symptoms, psychological well being, institutional conditions, symptom interpretation, behavior health experiences, and community reentry outcomes. Several contextual factors influence these experiences, including healthcare access, social support, trauma histories, supervision requirements, and halfway house policies. One important aspect of the model is symptom interpretation. Symptoms such as irritability, anxiety, fatigue, and difficulty concentrating may be interpreted as behavioral noncompliance rather than the manifestations of menopause. These interpretations may influence how women are treated, whether they seek support, and how they experience reentry. The theoretical framework directly informs the design of this study. The research questions focus on understanding the lived experiences of menopause during community reentry. Phenomenology is an important methodological approach because it seeks to understand how individuals experience a particular phenomenon. Participants will consist of approximately 10 to 15 justice involved women aged 40 to 65 residing in halfway houses who identify as experiencing menopausal or perimenopausal symptoms. Data will be collected through semi-structured interviews, allowing participants to describe their experiences in their own words. The findings will be analyzed to identify common themes and patterns across participants' experiences. The framework the framework supports understanding menopause at multiple levels. At the micro level, the focus is on the individual women and their experiences of menopause, including symptoms, emotional responses, and overall well being. At the meso level, the focus shifts to halfway houses, staff interactions, healthcare providers, supervision requirements, and available support systems. At the macro level, the study considers larger systems, including correctional policy, healthcare access, gender responsive programming, and structural inequalities affecting justice involved women. These levels demonstrate that menopause cannot be fully understood without considering the broader systems in which women live. The integration of these frameworks advances social work knowledge by examining an understudied intersection involving menopause, behavioral health, and community reentry. For direct practice, findings may help social workers and behavioral health professionals recognize menopause related symptoms and avoid misinterpreting them as behavioral dysfunction. For organizations, findings may support menopause informed assessments, staff training, and referral processes within halfway houses and reentry programs. For policy, findings may contribute to gender responsive reentry services that addresses women's health needs across the lifespan. Most importantly, this study centers the experiences of women whose voices have largely been absent from both menopause and reentry scholarship. Although these frameworks provide a strong foundation, they also have limitations. The biopsychosocial framework may not fully account for power dynamics, institutional control, gender inequality, and criminal justice involvement. The person and environment perspective may not fully explain the biological mechanisms underlying menopause. However, together, these frameworks complement one another. The strengths of one help address the limitations of the other, providing a more comprehensive understanding of menopause during community reentry. In conclusion, this study examines the lived experiences of justice involved women navigating menopause during community reentry. At its core, the study asks what happens when women are navigating an internal transition and an external transition simultaneously. By combining the biopsychosocial framework and the person and environment perspective, the study recognizes menopause as both a biological transition and a socially influenced experience. Ultimately, the goal is to increase understanding, improve practice, and contribute to more equitable and gender responsive support for justice involved women during midlife transition. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.